Hello, I'm the backup act. I'm Charles Briggs, the co-chair of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, and I'm Seth Holmes, the other co-director, is in Germany this year, and I would like to thank the co-sponsor for this event, which is the Center for Chinese Studies. We're very pleased to have with us, not just today, but for some period of time here in Berkeley, Sandra Hyde. And she will speak, we are told, for about 45 minutes, and then we will have questions and answers. She is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at McGill University, one that we consider to be one of our sister programs, really in terms of doing a tremendous amount of theoretical and critical work in terms of thinking about issues of health and medicine. Now, her current project, and the subject of today's talk, is a manuscript entitled Chasing the Dragon, Chinese Market Socialism, Psychosociability, and the Malleable Addict. Her two previous books are Eating Spring Rice, The Cultural Politics of AIDS in Southwest China, and Post-Colonial Disorders, Ethnographic Studies in Subjectivity, which is a co-edited volume. She has also published articles in a wide range of journals, from public health to philosophy, of course, anthropology, including her recent article, Spending My Own Money, Harming My Own Body, Addiction Care in a Chinese Therapeutic Community in Medical Anthropology. I would like to highlight just a few of the remarkable dimensions of eating spring rice. A dominant theme in recent anthropological scholarship has been a focus on mobility and circulation, on how people, technologies, ontologies, and the like are just made to seem naturally mobile. Mapping the circuits and the consequences of circulation has been crucial. Dr. Hyde engages this problematic in her careful ethnography of how HIV/AIDS becomes embedded in political and economic relations, embodied practices, and cultural imaginations in Yunnan province. As she looks with the same sensitivity and depth at discourses and practices of science and public health in post-reform China, and at the stories of everyday lives, infected perhaps more by those discourses than by HIV, she, in her own words, complicates the singular idea that it was only translocal bodies and not also government neglect or state-condoned unsafe blood banking practices that dispersed Chinese HIV. She begins with the seeming fact that the Thai minority in this area near the Thai border, due to its culture and a highly sexualized racial contour, was the locus of high rates of HIV/AIDS. These facts prompted her assignment as an anthropologist, quote, to find the cultural clues that predispose the Thai to risky sexual practices. She found her own rather less convenient facts. First, ethnic Thai sex workers turned out to be 90% Chinese Han, not even Chinese minorities. Dressing in Thai ethnic clothing, they literally embodied the sexualized ethnic figures that their clients desired. Second, she challenged the epidemiology that underlies this formulation, suggesting that the area is not really an HIV hotspot. Nevertheless, rather than simply claiming greater epidemiological authority, the very subject matter of statisticians, the actual processes, the micro-processes of statistical inquiry that allow us to understand these links between state regulation and statistics becomes her object of inquiry. She explores two different sets of narratives. The technical and the personal, documenting the first ethnographically, took her to explore epidemiology and the structure of certain public health practices. Her participation in a survey is particularly interesting here. It reminds me of the work of our ISSI fellow, Arun Sekarel, who wrote a book called Theory and Method in the Study of Argentine Fertility, where he did a survey in 1960s Argentina of conceptions about conception and about contraception that was kind of a sensitive topic then, and his real goal was to actually document what it means to make a survey, how surveys produce knowledge, and how the very knowledge-making practices themselves get erased in the course of this. And I think that the same level of insight comes out of this work on the survey. Now, Dr. Hyde also listened to the personal tales of sex workers and observed patrons in video shops, hair salons, cafes, movie theaters, and karaoke bars, and made visits to Thai visits in the countryside. As a result, she's able to tell a different kind of story about HIV/AIDS in China, to move away from time-based and spatial analyses that foster neat chronologies of HIV/AIDS, thereby fueling geographies of blame, to tell a complex and nuanced story, in her words, of everyday AIDS practices. It's a special pleasure to have her back with us because she is a graduate of the joint UCSF-UC Berkeley PhD in medical anthropology, and to have her with us for a time as a visiting scholar through May. So I hope that you'll enjoy being able to listen to her talk today, and also that you'll take the opportunity to be able to converse with her during this time. And the title of her talk, thank God she's got her text right in front of me, is Chasing the Dragon, the Malleable, Addict, and Shaming in a Chinese Therapeutic Community. Welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would really like to thank the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine and the Institute for the Study of Social Issues for facilitating my visit, especially Seth Holmes, who I contacted last year about this, to Charles Briggs for a wonderful introduction, and to the staff here who have just warmly welcomed me. I want to particularly thank Deborah Lustig, Cynthia Alvarez, and our wonderful videographer, CB. My deepest gratitude, as always, goes to the staff and residents of Sunlight, who I'm going to talk about today. So just a couple of things about the talk. My slides are on a continuous loop, so you could look at them once and forget about them, or you can continue to look at them. And the talk today is actually a chapter in my book, and so to make it into a talk, I've taken sort of 5 snippets to make it sort of more manageable. So, here we go. A warm wind blows through the tall pine and peach trees. Pigs snort, and a hard rain dings wet puddles into the red, dry earth. Through a puddle's reflection appears a 2-story building. It looks like the architect cut a church in half and welded it to a school, revealing a unique psychiatric facility among the fruit trees. Sunlight, which is my pseudonym, for this residential therapeutic community for drug addiction is located, or I should say was located, on a farm in southern Yunnan, where the residents arise early and begin their morning routine with inspections in old communist-style calisthenics and yoga after I arrived. The facility is unique. It aims to counter the punishment model of drug use, to see drug addiction as more than a crime, more than an aberration or an act against the state, to provide another model of care and recovery. Sunlight Residential TC carved out a space for caring for the self in a period of tumult, and it occupies a place of uneasy tension between what I call confessional modes of American-style 12-step Narcotics Anonymous programs, coercive Maoist self-criticism, and the Christian confessional. These all blend together within a military-like, rigorously structured regime. In thinking about this institution that I call Sunlight, that I've actually did fieldwork in on and off over the course of 8 years, where I lived and actually worked 24/7 with staff and up to 40 residents, and the longest period I was there was 3 months on my last sabbatical. There were men and women there, aged 18 to their late 40s. Most of them were Han Chinese. There was a small minority of Baizu, Huizu, Uyghurzu, and Tibetans. The in-house residents had a very wide range of occupations: truck drivers, former college students, a surgeon, businessmen, sex workers, athletes, diamond sellers, unemployed youth, fathers and mothers. Those who live at Sunlight are people who migrate from the periphery as former incarcerated drug criminals among the rising middle classes to the center of what I call it means to be a good patient and thus a good citizen. Free from HIV, free from drugs, and free from uncivil, uncultured, unproductive behavior. After living there, I began to reflect on what I call the trifecta of self, patient, and personhood. Effective therapeutics, what works, what doesn't, and why, and how these therapeutic regimes related to what I call China's hyper-development. My purpose was to understand Sunlight's quotidian therapies, its fraught nature binding China's past to its future, and to reveal its hybrid nature and how it made way for caring for the self in late socialism. In China today, like much of the world, heroin, amphetamines, and methamphetamines are popular due to their availability. Due to what local psychiatrists and sociologists label as personal frustrations with high rates of unemployment, emotional problems associated with rapid development, and the disrupting influence of massive rural to urban migration. In terms of class, it is both the disaffected rural youth who are unemployed when they migrate to the city, and on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, the middle class who frequent nightclubs and ingest illegal mind-altering drugs. Not so different than here. They do what one psychiatrist labeled was deadening their feelings to numb themselves. The therapeutic community, which I hereafter just call TC, model came to China via a joint project between the Chinese government and a group of concerned psychiatrists who specialized in drug dependency prevention, who understood drug use not as a crime against the state, as it was under Mao, but as a psychological condition that required amelioration, therapy, and close emotional work on the self. In the book, I try to link what I call geography, drugs, and therapy to allow for broader theoretical explorations into Sunlight as a site where China's post-reforms and openings lead to multiple conflicts and clashes between socialism and capitalism, the individual and the communal, and care and coerced discipline. As I said earlier, for today's talk, I present 5 snippets of Chapter 3 on shame. These are snippets that grew out of my graduate seminar called Rethinking Ethnography, and my AAA paper in honor of Mary Jo Del Vecchio and Byron Good. In writing my AAA tribute, my students and I got to thinking about why we frame everything as a problem-solution dyad. Could that also be another kind of public health post-colonial disorder? When we do frame things this way, it always means that something needs fixing, a solution, a development model. As I am fond of driving home, anthropology is good at identifying problems and public health good at identifying solutions. But we rarely get past these, fighting over what constitutes what. Lightning fixes for problems, rapid risk assessments, rapid needs assessments, rapid testing. We get in, we get out, like the shop down the road from me in Montreal called, in English, surprisingly, you breaky, we fixy, all one word. Anthropologists, on the other hand, spend long time studying a problem without ever touching public policy or health policy. Although in discussing deeply seated difficult social issues, we cannot ignore solutions, and neither can we entirely provide them. As my mother often reminds me, quoting the Talmud, you are not expected to complete the task, neither are you expected to put it down. So rather than framing a dyad of problems and solutions, in this chapter I shifted towards psychology that was embraced by literary theorists, namely affect theory and the anthropology of the emotions, with a twist towards what I call shame as a post-colonial disorder. There are many ways that shame functions in addiction treatment. From the very first day I was at Sunlight, I walked into the large foyer as if walking into this large hybrid school, where next to the upstairs railings and a round staircase, there were 3 residents, all sitting on small stools facing a wall. I asked my guide, what are they doing? He answered they're being shamed for behaviors during the previous day. I wondered to myself what act could result in residents to be shamed in such a fashion. I would learn that shame was a strange motivator in the life of Sunlight. Once residents came to stay, they and everyone who worked there were shamed on a daily basis. The idea was that shaming someone would somehow transform them, motivate them to become healthy citizens, what I call post-drug, post-socialist, post-ill. But if shame But is shame really an emotion that motivates anybody? Brené Brown, who's a popular social psychologist who writes extensively on shame, you should check out her TED Talks, says that shame digs deep. It creates grooves in our psychic lives beyond belief. Liberally borrowing from that old adage from Clifford Geertz, that people know what they do, they often know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does. I ask the question, what does the therapy of shame and shaming therapy do in this context? So, snippet 1, therapy based on shaming. In thinking about what we do does, I pose 2 questions for thinking at the intersection of subjectivity and the social psychological dimensions of individual and collective lives in the onslaught of hyperglobalization. 1, how do Chinese users of illegal street drugs learn to perform their emotions as part of ritual narratives of Narcotics Anonymous and self-healing? And 2, how does one write a clinical ethnography of the emotions in China? If sunlight is a clinical space that rises and falls within a particular set of institutions and ideas that travel across the globe, behavior modification, AA, Narcotics Anonymous, mind-body treatments, harm reduction, and abstinence, what do these modalities say about what Canadian author Miriam Toews calls a complicated kindness? All of the therapeutic concepts that take root at Sunlight have traveled across wide spaces, both physical and metaphorical, to reach China, to reach its peer educators, its psychiatrists, and former drug users. I argue here we find subjects performing rituals that lead to a complicated kind of care and healing. So, my shift from talking about therapy as performance, which is chapter 1, to discuss shaming in chapter 2, or what the Chinese call losing face, 丢面子, is because shame is thought of as pure affect with little performative power. In Freud's early work, he claimed affect does not so much reflect or think, it just acts. Sylvan Tompkins notes in Freud's early work he considered mental illness as a disorder of feelings, and only later reduced things to biological drives. Moving from Freud and Tompkins, I take up the quotidian practices of peer group therapy. And I note, as both an observer and a participant in peer group therapy sessions, group play, art therapy, group discussions, group critiques. Performance theory didn't quite satisfy my thirst for understanding this clinical setting and addiction. I start from shame, as I feel even as I problematize the conditions and practices within Sunlight. As an ethnographer, I also experience the therapeutic with a dose of shame and shaming. Speaking more personally, last year I lost one of my friends to addiction and mental illness. What startled me was up until the end, friends and family had very different understandings of their illness. Those that understood their demise as a painful mental disorder retained a deep-seated set of emotions around care and love and grief, versus those that saw this person as primarily an addict, where sorrow was drenched with the shame that surrounded their death, shaming the person, shaming those of us who believed in a dual diagnosis for someone who dug so deep into life itself. What is it that allows us to claim mental illness as a disease and addiction as a profound moral failing, when so often they manifest simultaneously? Central to the phenomenology of addiction is a crazy divided will, desiring to be a certain way as a personal inner struggle. But merely labeling and recognizing this as a problem of the will, what does will mean in a post-socialist context? And what does shaming do to encourage certain kinds of willpower? But shame is not just an onus on those who self-medicate with drugs. Even in our own paddling pools of academia, we shame in often subtle and not so subtle ways. In researching shame, I stumbled upon an interesting anecdote by the Australian shame researcher Elspeth Probyn in her book, Blush. Probyn describes a feminist conference where the keynote speaker moved from denunciations of men to requisite denunciations of what she called painted fembots, to conclude by venerating Greek male philosophers. As a brave graduate student, Probyn pulled herself up to the microphone and asked, "What is it about the male Greeks?" The prominent speaker said she didn't understand the question. Then turning towards the audience said, "What is it about these frigid women?" The entire audience hissed, and having been dutifully shamed, Probyn literally called out as she was booed. How many of us haven't been shamed by our peers? Probyn is not the only humanities scholar to pick up on notions of shame. Although as an Australian feminist, she was brought to her knees, full of emotion, seeing Uluru Rock for the first time, of course with midnight oils, Beds Are Burning playing full tilt in the background. She describes moving from pure exaltation to sobbing in shame, noting that she felt the heat of shame ripped into me physiologically and beyond cognitive control. As such, she began to explore Australians' deeply seated notions and sense of shame towards Australia's colonial past and the horrendous violence through the state's current treatment of Australian Aboriginals. She asked, "How can we both listen and speak shame?" Acknowledging that some sorts of shame are easier to narrate than others, she notes in all stories of shame, we must also ask what is productive. So let me digress just a teeny bit and give you a little bit of background. Policymakers and citizens alike view illegal drug use in China as a threat to social stability and also as a sign of moral failure. The means to treat and prevent illegal drug use constitutes one social, political, and public health dilemma that I think threatens to challenge China's representation as an Asian success story. Yet as I have observed since I began going to China 30 years ago, the solutions for addressing that drug dilemma are gradually shifting as a result of larger changes occurring in society. More specifically, there has been a slow transition in terms of psychiatry from community reform and punishment to dealing with individual psychology. Individualization as a neoliberal concern is very much misunderstood in China, despite the fact that it reaches back towards the first communist revolution in the late 1940s and forward to the second market revolution beginning in the late 1970s. In thinking about individualization in China, anthropologist Yan Yunxiang states that Chinese modernity is the realization of three dreams: a strong state, a wealthy nation, and a prosperous individual. Chinese addicts are encouraged to become successful entrepreneurs, inventors, and business people, to redefine and recreate themselves in the service of their family, the nation, and the globe. While many theorists have stated that neoliberal ideas on the role of the individual are important for understanding China, the Chinese tend to not think of individualism in the way we do in the West, since constrained political rights limit the rise of a neoliberal state. Neoliberalism in China did not follow the post-1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe and Russia, but rather began with discussions among intellectuals during the Qing dynasty about what kind of state China would need to modernize. Moving from the late Qing to the Republican era, we see that China's history and the distraught battles over opium meant that illegal drugs and addiction are not new phenomena. They have a much longer history. Okay, back to what's productive about shame. The residents of Sunlight were children of the Reform era, born in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, during a time of massive economic change and political upheaval, who have now become what I call the cast-offs and shadows of China's economic reform and opening. But what kind of model are TC Therapeutics, the goal to refashion the self, focusing on malleability, and learning to live with and without shame? Jumping forward to the late 1990s, the Yunnan provincial government's Institute for Drug Abuse, which is part of the Ministry of Health, teamed up with the American NGO called Sunlight to rally a few psychiatrists who were drug treatment specialists to advocate stepping away from treating drug use as a crime towards treating it as a psychological malady, a malady that required malleability in various forms of affect. Still, there are many contradictions, as their processes do not always match their goals. Meaning, how can one reduce shame by making former addicts walk through a therapeutic model based on shame? Some might embrace the philosophy that addiction was a malady curable through intensive group therapy and also moral retraining. It thus drew on assumptions about folk theories of addiction at the same time it adhered to punitive approaches to healing. As is common in many TCs worldwide, all lay therapists who run Sunlight are themselves recovered addicts. The exception was the doctor and nurse team that arrived every 3 days for a 72-hour shift, and the farmers who tended the surrounding small farm and orchard. Every new staff member or long-term visitor, including myself, would participate in a 1-month practicum that required him or her to be part of therapeutic sessions and live in accordance with the center's rules, including being subject to critique. Critiques were the mainstay of every therapeutic activity and were scheduled twice a day, once in the morning and once at night. These sessions draw on what I call two different epistemologies. First, there is the legacy of the political struggle sessions that came of age during the Cultural Revolution. And second, a hybrid form of Christian confessional of Narcotics Anonymous. Here, recovering users are urged to confess their wrongdoings related to behaviors about being ill and addicted, or in my case, just being lazy with my belongings. Not paying attention, sleeping through therapy, not doing one's job, sneaking in heroin. Sunlight is regularly criticized for treating addicts in ways that mark them as morally flawed, and shameful in respects no different than how we treat and shame addicts in Euro-America. The world over, we blame addicts for their conditions. In China, due to a long and complicated and often confusing relationship with psychiatry, there are even more reasons to burst open notions of shame and addiction. As Wenrei Chun notes, China's current psychology boom could easily become a psychology bust because of the mercurial history in China and the fact that many NGOs sponsor psychological support centers are based on individual therapy and confidentiality. A recent political shift in the form of the 2015 Foreign NGO Management Law moves registration of NGOs from the Ministry of Civil Affairs to the Ministry of Public Security, whereby the security police will vet NGOs by determining whether potential security threats exist within the organization or its mission. As of this year, all local NGOs that have any foreign ties also come under careful scrutiny, and President Xi Jinping's ever-increasing surveillance apparatus of those who might be critical of his hardliner regime in the name of bolstering anti-terrorism. But back to my larger picture of shame and shaming. Shame follows us everywhere. From literature and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, Ursula, the wife of Colonel Buendia, survives to 100, but with a life filled with shame. In Shakespeare's Othello, shame penetrates many scenes of the play where Iago is passed over by Cassio for his promotion. His own sense of rage leads to what psychologists call a burst of negative emotions: jealousy, rage, hurt, and shame. Mining popular culture, again we have Brené Brown, who writes that shame creates grooves in our psychic lives beyond belief. Shame is an unspoken epidemic, the secret behind many forms of broken behaviors. But here is where she differs. Right behind shame, she says, is vulnerability. And this is where she diverges. For her, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. Adaptability to change is all about vulnerability. In trying to balance the kind of biopolitics of the emotions, what Lisa Stevenson calls the psychic life of biopolitics, we end up borrowing both a humanitarian sense of the emotions and a biological notions of affect. We are no longer trying to struggle between two different ways of thinking of the body and shame. We are now removed from what feminist philosopher Alison Jaeger calls Plato's model, where emotions are like horses needing control by character. If we take this blending of the psychological, the cultural, the biological, and the social, where the body does not deny what's written on it, the blush of the skin, which often means we try to hide our faces through what the Chinese aptly call losing face. In contrary, those who don't feel shame are sociopaths. Anthropologist Andrews Discern notes in his work among the Hagen in Papua New Guinea that they have a saying, "If you have no shame on your skin, you are crazy." But they also had another interesting saying, "I shame you into a new kind of humanity." So what I'm saying here is, instead of reading what occurs in this TC as an extension of a draconian communist system that denies the emotions, we end up in a place where learning the emotions, performing your emotions, you find at the very heart of all functions of Sunlight shame, meaning I, peer educator, shame you into a new kind of humanity. That is exactly what Sunlight, with all its regimentation and social structure, does. It attempts to bring people back from the brink of despair and destruction toward health and healing. But it does so in not so straightforward or easy ways. Take Xiao Ma, a young man of 30 who walked into the TC with his eyes downcast. They were two black holes. A body frail from heroin. And then 6 months later, he walks out with fat on his bones, a smile on his face, joking about where he's going to take me on a date. This story isn't necessarily about success, as he returns 2 years later with eyes like two black holes. As Angela Garcia, among others, point out, addiction gets read as an illness that cycles back and forth between recovery and relapse over and over again. Conversely, this is merely one part of the story. Shame is a fact of life, and in many cultures, especially Chinese post-socialism, it is a part of managing human social interaction. Therefore, it made total sense that it would be a function as a form of therapeutic motivation in a Chinese TC. Thinking in tandem with academic writings on shame, just what is it that shame produces? In the following 3 anecdotes, I suggest that out of intensive confrontational therapy comes something else. It produces effects that are felt on multiple levels, physiologically, socially, and culturally. Xiao Li, a young woman in her late 30s and former drug user, said, when she first came to Sunlight, I participated in the Recount Your Emotions group, also in what was called aptly the Missed Opportunities group. Both groups made me think, in all of my 35 years, what I missed out on. I realized after participating in these groups, there was so much I missed out on. That I came to realize all these people hadn't given up on me. That I really felt as a human being, other people at Sunlight truly touched me. Another resident, Xiao Du, who was in his late 20s, said that instead of thinking about what comes next and how to get there, it's important to just be in the moment. He used the analogy of a beautiful and delicious apple that is right in front of you. That you cannot enjoy it if you're thinking about the past and the future. You miss the present moment and the presence of joy in eating an apple. Xiao told me 2 miao sayings that reflected this. The first one was, 知山往指那山高. It's always the other mountain that looks higher, meaning we always think the grass is greener and are never happy where we are. The second saying was, 到那个山头唱什么歌? At the mountaintop, what song shall we sing? That when one reaches a peak or a place, one should focus on being happy, singing a song rather than worrying about getting to the next mountaintop or the next task. Xiao Du needed to remind himself of these sayings, as he was so caught up in searching when he was using drugs that he missed joy in present moments. Sunlight, for him, gave him back what he called a sense of what was important in life. But not all residents at Sunlight thought of the TC's methods as a saving grace or the answer to their addictions. Xiao Dong, also in his 30s, who I had long conversations with over his time at Sunlight, and then also when he left a couple years later, said to me, I didn't just start thinking about drug addiction when I came to Sunlight. I started thinking about this problem. I thought about it before, even when I was using. I still don't know why I use drugs. Because there are people who got introduced to drugs at the same time I did, in the same day, at the same time, at the same place. There were 4 of us, 4 good friends. 3 became drug users, but one of them did not. He's never touched drugs to this day. He had the same education I did, the same experiences, are completely the same as mine. So I think I had a problem even before I started doing drugs. And I'm still to this day trying to find out where the problem is. And even at Sunlight, I haven't figured that out. Interestingly, Chaldon became an evangelical Christian, a way of living that he said gave him hope and a new life, something he was very critical of at Sunlight. That they asked people to change without providing any replacement philosophy or jobs. He often said, if you take away communism and drugs, what do you replace them with? Part 4. Sarah Ahmed, in her work on shame, says that any reconciliation means acknowledging that shame, and through shame we reach out to one another. Ahmed notes this is problematic also because in the Indo-European meaning of shame is to cover, and by extension to cover oneself, to hide because one has been overexposed. Meaning shame is as much about concealment as it is about exposure, wounding, and vulnerability. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Adam Frank, drawing on the work of psychologist Sylvan Tompkins, say that shame isn't always a negative emotion. Shame constructs whole universes and ways of being in a community. According to my colleague, Lawrence Kiermaier, Sylvan Tompkins fell out of favor in the field of psychiatry and was resurrected, actually, in the late 1990s by literary and queer theorists Sedgwick and Frank. They, and I, felt that Sylvan Tompkins' formulations startled for their sharpness and daring, for his descripted level-headedness as a psychiatrist who kind of envisioned a Mobius strip linking the ever-ending nodes of biology, psychology, neurology, and culture. For Tompkins, shame operates only after interest or enjoyment has been activated. Without positive effect, there can be no shame. Only a sense that offers you enjoyment or engages your interest can make you blush. It is only when we are truly interested in something do we care to be embarrassed by it, because we cannot measure up. Tompkins suggests that there are pulsations of cathexia around shame, are what enable or disable so basic a function as the ability to be interested in the world. Meaning that shame illuminates our intense attachment to the world, our desire to be connected with others. That shame isn't just a sickness of the soul. That human beings do fail. And in our failures, just as Proman, Ahmed, Brown, Sedgwick, and Frank reiterate, we see shame in another light, as productive rather than just regressive. Part 5, Shaming Therapy. Sunlight TC has been fraught with all kinds of problems from the start. Finding a suitable location, securing that location only to have the provincial government claim their land for Kunming's second city, then packing up and moving back to the main office in Kunming, only to have the principal director and psychiatrist arrested for experimenting with traditional Chinese medicine as an alternative to methadone. Shame is written into the history of the organization as a failed gongo. And now it is just an NGO without government support. An interesting turn of events that have politicized the director. This past summer, he told me, I'm now on your side, the activist side. This government doesn't really care about addicts. All they care about is making money from methadone. It is both sad to see him demoted, but also helpful to feel exonerated for my own feelings about the organization and its government connections. The Yunnan Institute of Drug Abuse and its former director, Dr. Li Jianhua, also told me this summer that he has decided that therapeutic communities take a long time to get people off drugs like heroin. And in many ways, IDA, like many other institutions, are moving like the rest of the world towards a neuropsychobiomedical model, where brain chemistry and pharmaceuticals like methadone and naltrexone substitution are bolstered in China by hardliner models of imprisonment, incarceration, and death. Still, there are schisms and fissures among physicians, psychiatrists, and former drug users. Dr. Yang, the director, still fervently supports Sunlight's methods, even more so after reflecting on them in prison for 9 months. According to Dr. Lee and colleagues of Dr. Yang was subject to unfair patent laws combined with some poor judgment about borrowing a traditional medicinal formulary and testing it out as an alternative to methadone in an environment unlikely to support his experiment. While one might argue that Sunlight's form of therapeutics led to a reification of Foucauldian and Maoist policing, I suggest that what stands out are subjects that need and desire to perform through therapeutic rituals that lead to various kinds of healing. Here, aggregates of post-colonial disorders, quasi-religious beliefs, and post-socialist practices find interesting bedfellows in the space of the rehabilitation center and residential treatment that congeal in and through the performance spaces for therapy. In closing, I return to the idea of shame as a post-colonial disorder, how we shame one another, and how shame worked in the intersubjective spaces of Sunlight. Here, every resident, peer educator, director, and anthropologist was shamed on a daily basis. Shame became a life force. But what kind of life force was it? I surmised that losing face was so strong in the Chinese context that one could only stay at Sunlight if they agreed to change. Health activists often say that TCs do not work. They are fundamentally about tapping into negative emotions and driving them home. The idea that shame really is an emotion that motivates anyone is certainly problematic, unsettling, and perhaps frightening. Still, there is another way of thinking about the process of shaming and shame. As Sylvan Tompkins, Eve Sedgwick, Elspeth Probyn, Sarah Ahmed, Brene Brown write, that sometimes shame just moves us into community. It binds us together and takes us into the spaces of vulnerability in order to change us. In closing, I share with you a snippet of Sunlight's motto that resonates with what their methods have taught me. Where else but in our common ground can I find such a mirror? Together here I can appear clearly to myself, not as a giant of my dreams, nor the dwarf of my fears, but as a person, part of the whole, with my share in its purpose. Thank you. Yes, I will take my own question. Any questions? Yes, Ray.
You talked about the Chinese government agreeing with the TC to open the center, but the center also seems to have a Christian teaching mission as well. That sounds like a strange thing for the Chinese government to encourage.
Well, it's kind of complicated. The group of psychiatrists from the Institute of Drug Abuse, when they began looking at alternatives to prison, they found an organization, international organization, it's actually based in the States. And that organization was run by a Roman Catholic Monsignor. And that organization in the States is much more religious than in China. But a lot of the staff at Sunlight were Christians. And so Christianity was sort of muted because, of course, it's seen in China in many ways, religion was kind of seen as an opiate of the masses and superstition. But the Christian church, from what I know, people who study it in China, it's booming right now. And so you've kind of had Christianity come in as a thread. It's certainly, nobody goes to church. There is what they call Bible therapy on Wednesday afternoons, which a group of Christian former addicts come in and sing songs and read the Bible. But it was always, the director was always really clear that it was considered a kind of therapeutic rather than something that blanketed the whole center. So it's interesting to me, that they were allowed to do this, and they were. And that is not the reason why there's been this kind of push to close the center. It has much more to do with biomedicine and psychiatry and pharmaceuticals. that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I have a question about shaming, because what would be the Chinese word that they use for shaming? Or
Shaming in this sense is really me appropriating the idea of criticizing somebody. So peeping, yeah.
So when you saw three people facing the wall,
they were being criticized for
by
yeah,
peers.
right.
Oh, interesting. Because the reason why I ask is that I myself do research in Yunnan.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's why I'm fascinated by your talk. The reason why I ask is also because in Yunnan there was a Han Chinese word people use very often. It's haixiu.
Yes.
So haixiu is a range of emotions starting from shyness to embarrassment
Right.
to ashamed.
Right.
And they use it all the time on all
Yeah.
occasions. I'm just wondering.
But it's interesting, in this context, they didn't use it.
So
They didn't use haixiu. They mainly used, I think for me, it was more looking at the process of criticism, but I interpret it more, because criticism to us in the West means something very different than it means in China. And that's sort of where I kind of welded these.
if I may have a
Yeah.
question related to the Christianity question.
Yes, please answer.
Because you mentioned that not only, well, first of all, a comment is that in Yunnan, ethnic minorities, a lot of them, they're Christians because the missionaries were very successful in these areas instead of in the early 20th century. And also, for some reason, the government was more tolerant about mainland Christian churches. On the other hand, you mentioned there were Uyghurs and Tibetans and Hui people in the center. How is it possible that they choose to come to a Christian?
Well, the center is only quasi-Christian, right? I mean, the center,
They do have Bible study.
they have Bible study, but only once every, I said once a week, but it's every 2 weeks. And the people who come in are part of the underground Christian church that are former addicts. And I think part of it is because the director is a Christian, but the center has no Christian ties anywhere. Like if you were to try and find these ties, I mean, I'm telling you these kind of strings.
With that map.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So even with that map, with this American connections, there's no monetary or like financial.
No, well, initially, I mean, the organization Sunlight is quasi-Christian, and most therapeutic communities around the world are. Like, when you go to Hong Kong, almost all of the drug therapy are run by Christians, right? So what I'm saying is there's a connection there, but it wasn't set up as a Christian organization. It was set up by, as one of my guides said, no, the philosophy here is communism. Yeah. But of course it seeps in because, the nurses that work there, the doctors, I mean, they often, not all of them, and certainly in terms of religious practice, it was never discussed, and only a very small percentage of people even went to these Christian sessions. Yeah, interesting though. But Yunnan's history is very interesting in terms of that. Yes?
I guess two things. First, just a comment still on the Christianity thing. It's really, that's really interesting to me because I worked in a clinic doing addiction treatment in the UK, and there were all sorts of like complementary therapies providing things like Buddhist meditation techniques. And this is like, you see this a lot in medicine in Europe and North America, the sort of use of Buddhism, where there's a class that's sort of teaching, I think, like Sufi meditation things. So it's kind of, it's maybe not that surprising in that context that you could also see a kind of like secularized, therapeuticized Christianity being used in a way that doesn't necessarily mark the institution itself.
No. I mean, I think McGill now in the medical school actually has a class on mindfulness that is taught to our med students. So there is kind of an adoption of these sort of spiritual practices, absolutely, in medicine. Yes?
Yeah, thinking in the huge population here in the United States, especially in Berkeley, we have a people's park.
Right across the
There are
street.
a lot of people who unfortunately suffer from addiction. And what is different about the shame over there and shame over here?
Maybe there isn't. Maybe there, I mean, I think the difference is that the population I'm dealing with are not people who are living in a park. Most of the people that I'm living with have been picked up by the police, and they do pay a small fee for being at this center. So unless a couple of people were on scholarships, and the center is very low budget, but most of the people there are people that have homes and families. And I think that is partly a difference. And I also think that China's relationship with illegal drugs is very different than here. I mean, we were just talking earlier about, Oakland buying into being, a medical marijuana dispensary. That certainly hasn't happened in China.
Yeah, but I'm talking about this shame.
Yeah.
And it's the way the people treat the people treating people.
Yeah.
Well,
I wanted to do initially a comparison between this center and a similar center in New York, and I couldn't get in. So I don't know that I can really justify in answering your question, because I haven't spent time, in a similar center in the United States to make those kinds of comparisons. The comparisons I have are people that have come from the States to China who then describe the center to me. So it's always secondhand information. Yeah?
Of course, one thing is if you look at Somerson Carr's book, it seems as if rather than shame, the particular sort of reinforcement of ways of creating the self seem to be more the sort of, the therapy-based sort of construction of models of the ed. But my question was, so if we think about, Narva is probably familiar to most people here in Angela Garcia's pastoral clinic, she sort of thinks about an overall landscape of affect, particularly based around melancholia. And thinking about, race and ethnic studies, thinking about the way in which melancholia in colonialism and racial oppression is different along those lines, and then sort of tries to place therapy within this broader, historically based and politically, economically grounded sort of landscape of affect. Would there be one? And that's a big generalization, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Would you see that there would be this sort of dominant, overarching landscape of affect into which sunlight intervenes, or would it be more fragmented and more complex than that in this situation?
Angela's book, particularly talking about, New Mexico, and where she worked in New Mexico as having the highest rate of heroin users in the United States. I think in China, I think there are threads of that when I talk about this generation sort of being the cast-offs of development. And they often describe themselves in that way. Like, I went from, living on the streets to being the director of Volvo China in such a short time that it was just so emotionally difficult, and that drugs were my way of kind of numbing myself. But at the same time, in China, in business, alcohol is often used to grease the wheels of many business meetings, and a number of the residents said so was heroin. So it wasn't just this idea that you were sort of using it on the side illegally. It was sort of part of the greasing the wheels of business relations in certain contexts. And so it kind of reminds me, when I was in high school, and people kind of, this is going to date me, heroin was the chic drug. The kids that used heroin were the wealthiest kids in the school. And, when I was in high school, cocaine was also extremely expensive drug. And so it's interesting to see, where this has come in, to China. And now we're discovering, new heroin epidemics in the United States that are, and in Canada, certainly along the sort of Canadian, northeastern, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine border. But yeah, I don't know that I have one word yet that I could describe this whole generation, other than kind of thinking about them as being kind of what canaries in a coal mine, kind of, in terms of the downside of rapid urbanization and globalization.
Maybe that's better, actually.
Is that better?
Have one word that
Okay.
sort of sums it all up.
Okay, I'm going to take Kelly.
Yeah, I had a question kind of related to that. I mean, you kind of just answered it in some ways, but I'm really curious about that kind of analysis where the people who were coming for addiction treatment had sort of an understanding of being in environments where drug use may have been used and kind of getting caught up in that way. With the business dealings, or maybe some discourse about them being in a certain generational position, like some kind of structural analysis of the environments that they were in that might have contributed to them getting caught up in addiction. And then the example that you gave, which was so interesting, of one of the men there were 4 other people there, and 3 of us became drug users and 1 of us didn't, and we had the same education, and so I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about, sort of, in some ways I heard from the example that he was trying to say we had the same advantages, or we had the same social history, but I don't know why I became a drug user, and I don't know why I still am. And I was just wondering about the shame thing, and for people, like, how did that fit in? Like, people who had maybe a structural environmental analysis of their drug use, or a peer analysis, and then them like individuating it, like thinking about it as an affect or as a psychic problem within themselves. Because it seemed like with the shame thing, was the shame thing about being an unproductive citizen, like failing as a citizen, or was it failing as a person? And then, just trying to connect those things a little bit more.
Yeah. No, I think it's all of those things. I think I think it's failure. I mean, I think, when you talk to the political leaders about this, for them it's about a failure as a citizen.
As an individual.
As an individual, right? But when you talk to the peer educators, or when you talk about, the users themselves and the psychiatrists, I mean, they saw it very much kind of more as a generational, and there's a shift. I mean, they've also now talked about, and we'll see where this goes, that there's been a shift from heroin to other kinds of drugs. And, one of the last in-services that I sat in on China, there were so many drugs in Yunnan, and the translation of them, I'm going to have to find somebody to help me, because I didn't even know what half these things were. I mean, I've never even heard of that. It's a flooded market, and it's partly because you have the drug trade coming up through Burma, Vietnam, Laos into Yunnan, and also, as I've showed before, it's also come in through the stands, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan. But that's a whole different, heroin problem. And there are people. There's a wonderful scholar in Taiwan called Liu Shaohua, who has written on HIV/AIDS and heroin use among minority groups, where whole groups of people in one, ethnic village are heroin addicts. And I think what was interesting, a lot of people, in critiques of some of my articles, people will say, well, where are the minorities? Like, people are always trying to say, where are the minorities here? And I keep having to say to them, well, the majority of people in Yunnan, when you look at the epi-stats, they're mainly young Han men. And so there were not minorities there, but they were far and few between. Like, there was one guy who was Uyghur, and he and I used to eat breakfast together, because I'm not very good at eating greasy hot noodles for breakfast. I used to eat oatmeal. And he couldn't eat the noodles because there was pork in them. And so every morning we used to go into the central room together and have breakfast. And, I got to know him really, really well that way. But I think you're right. I think, Kelly, I need to think a little bit more about those connections.
What about the family? Like, is there the kind of the psychodynamic sort of early childhood trauma or intergenerational drug use narrative that you see a
It
lot.
wasn't there at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's where,
To a certain kind of
right.
Christian narrative.
And it was there in terms of thinking, I mean, I should reframe that. It's not like it wasn't there at all, but it wasn't the main narrative. It wasn't the main narrative. And the other thing that I think, and I don't know because again I haven't been in a treatment center in the States, is everything was done very group oriented. Like it was a generation of kids who'd grown up in a time, where communism was about sort of group collective activity. And so, one of the anecdotes that I have in the book is I got asked to be the art therapist one Wednesday afternoon and the art therapist didn't show up. So I called a friend of mine in Kunming who is a psychologist and I said, what the hell am I going to do? I'm not an art therapist. And so he gave me some ideas and I did this exercise on drawing the road home. I said, what does it look like to leave here and go home and what's on that route? And I divided them up into small groups. And I wanted, being individually oriented, I gave everybody a piece of paper and a whole bunch of crayons and pens and whatever. And they each picked the best artist in each group to draw one picture, which I thought was fascinating. Because I don't think if you had done the same thing here, you would have had that sort of collective responsibility, like, well, Xiao Li actually went to art school, so we're picking her, because you're not going to see my terrible drawing. And I drew a picture myself, because I said, well, I'm going to make you draw, I'm going to draw too. And they're like, oh, but, Teacher Hyde, that's what I was called. But Teacher Hyde, you can draw. And I said, well, so can you. So there is this kind of, I think, tension between the behavioral family systems theory and then this sort of older collectivity. Yeah. Yes?
No, I have the same problem as you have, that I haven't been inside, but group, shame, criticism, data, synonym, Delancey.
They all do it.
Totally. It's the anchor, it's continual, and it's also the place you acquire identity and the possibility of mobility.
Right.
So we have to cleanse your false selves. You're resisting. You're trying to hold on to honor in your failure. So is that the dealing with the crisis of late capitalism in a collective manner, which is a parallel dealing with the crisis of a fallen colonialism? I mean, the treatment technique seems to be maybe even more rigorous in Synon and Delancey. So, if you compare individualistic versus collectivized.
Yeah. No, I mean, the model came from the United States, which then, like you said, has a much longer history. But I think the difference, as an anthropologist, I think the difference is what happens to the model when it gets to China. It's not exactly the same as from what I've read about, Synanon, Daytop, these other. Because the interesting part is and this is a totally different chapter, when you have people from the US come to the China model, they're very critical of it.
Oh, they're not doing it right.
They're not doing it right, exactly. They're not doing it right. Yeah. American exceptionalism. Sorry, I missed you. Yes.
It's a difference between the getting for
Well, my question is evolving. And back to what you were talking about, traditional Chinese medicine for curing or treating methadone addiction. I saw an irony in that because Glide Memorial Methodist Church in the Tenderloin in San Francisco had a African American who had gone to China and learned traditional Chinese medicine and was using it to reduce or eliminate addiction. So is that what China is doing? You said it was for profit? Making methadone, or what was the...
Well, the problem is, I mean, this is a whole nother history of the relationship between Western biomedicine and Chinese traditional medicine. Because you have, in Yunnan, you have a parallel where Chinese traditional medicine was held up, like people like Mao Zedong, as, a gift of China to give the world in terms of its compendium and its knowledge. But with biomedicine now in China, there's a lot of bashing of traditional Chinese medicine. I mean, evidence-based medicine, when we think about evidence-based medicine here, the Chinese have embraced evidence-based medicine more than anybody else in the world. And so that then contradicts this Chinese medicinal. And the problem with Sunlight is that their money-making wing, which is again was linked, no longer linked, to the government, was methadone clinics. And so to come in and say, okay, we're going to replace methadone with Chinese traditional medicine, then cuts into, the funding for, government agencies and this project. And, there's a longer story there in terms of why he went to prison that I didn't present here in full breach. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people that I talked to, including him himself, he just said, I have really bad luck. And interestingly enough, I think the reason he was only in prison for 9 months is his wife was a very high-ranking Communist Party cadre, and she hired a lawyer and eventually got him out. They were going to keep him in there for longer. But it really changed his way that he looks at China and addiction, and I think he's even more invested in keeping the TC alive. Angela.
Yeah, I'm sure there are other people here who aren't familiar with the Chinese context at all. Well, maybe I'm the only one. But so for me, that's the context that I really don't know very much about China. But to come back to what you were saying about this is a model brought from the US, so it seems like a familiar model. And the lady in the back, the woman in the back, was asking about, how is shame different in the Chinese context? And over here, the woman was bringing up the idea of criticism. And I suppose this is the part of it that I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more about, because you said that there are kind of two epistemological critiques here. There's the cultural, one coming from the Cultural Revolution, which I presume is this idea of the critique. I don't know. And then the kind of Christian confessional, which is maybe what we're more used to from the Western notion of the kind of AA approach. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, maybe it's too much, but it was sort of two things. One was first, which is like, how is shame, the axes of shame different for men and women in the clinic? And the second one was, how do Chinese addicts and this Chinese institution, you said there's shame running through the institution, but how does it relate to this Chinese notion of the critique that comes out of, as you mentioned, the Cultural Revolution? Only because that's what I don't know about. So I mean, maybe it's obvious. But.
Well, I think. Let me answer the general question. No. It's a lot of questions, but they're good questions. Angela was part of my dissertation group at Berkeley, so we go way back. I think the gender aspect of it is something that I kind of really struggled. There were a lot less women at the center than there were men. The women were perceived as being more far gone than the men. They were perceived as using heroin for a longer period of time. They were perceived as less socially redeemable. Like the number of times I heard staff saying, oh, she's just going to marry a rich man. That's what she's looking for as a husband. Which when you talk to her, that's not exactly what she was looking for at all. So there definitely was kind of a strong influence of sexism, not so much from the director, but from some of the frontline medical staff. And there's definitely, that was the main distinction between people who were former users and people who weren't. The users themselves, there was an effort. Yunnan University has one of the emerging schools of social work in China. And so there were social workers that came into the center to try and do kind of more gender-based analysis. I think one of my slides, I show a homophobia desensitization exercise, which certainly came out of the social work. But I think the thing about that too was that in another episode where they did something called gender and feelings group. Again, the social worker didn't show up one day, so they asked me to take over. And what was interesting is I drew out, there's this Taiwanese cartoonist called Jimmy, and I took some of Jimmy's sort of cartoons on speaking to gender, and I brought these groups together, and I did like an all women's group and an all men's group, and then brought them together. And what was fascinating to me was the kinds of responses I expected them to give me about gender bias just weren't there. Like they just didn't see what I was seeing. You know, they often said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, if some man behaves that way to me, I'm just going to dump him. Or nobody ever treats me that way. I'm treated as an equal here. So that's one thing. And in terms of your second question, which is a much larger question about, you know, how do you link these things? You know, how do you link what was particularly Chinese? I mean, I think the way that I've tried to link it is kind of to try and show the different threads, like what the different groups were, how they were composed, what it was like, you know, to be in a group when they were talking about somebody's family. Now, one thing I did not get to do at the center is the intake sessions with the staff and their families, which go very deeply into history. I did not do. I did ask history questions in my interviews, and I did hear a little bit about that from, you know, some of the staff that I got to know. But I don't really have that kind of in-depth information. And I call the system a hybrid system. I mean, I think it's not Synanon. It's kind of a hybrid of what TCs are, because it has this longer history of politics and criticism, self-criticism. And I have to say that, you know, what amazed me was how easy people found to criticize one another. And me, even me, you know. And I remember the first time I was criticized, I was shaking like a leaf. Because you have to stand up in front of the whole group and have them criticize you. And I literally was like going like this. And they're laughing at me. Because they do it on a regular basis. And they're like, you know, Teacher Hyde, why are you so nervous? But I don't know, Angela, I've really come up with an answer to that, other than that it's a hybrid system between these different ways of looking at things. And one thing that was interesting, one of the directors from the States came to the center, and we had this really interesting conversation between the Chinese director, the American representative, and myself. And the American representative and myself saw this sort of, and the American representative was Chinese American, had grown up actually in China. He and I saw this political history, whereas the Chinese psychiatrist said, oh, no, this comes right out of the United States. You know, this critique comes right out of the model in the U.S. And then the guy who runs the model in the U.S. said, that's not what we do. So you end up with this sort of contradictory responses to, and that's why I call it a hybrid system. I think that's the kind of way to draw on those threads. Thanks.
Well, I have a question that's kind of been answered, but it feels like it's almost not shame then. I mean, what you came to at the end was, you know, part of being, you know, creating this collective. And it seems like shame for us is very much about setting an individual apart and, you know, labeling someone as, you know, deviant. And if shame is normative, if you're being, you know, if you're being shamed or criticized, then yeah, it just feels.
But it's still individual. It's not like the group is being shamed.
No,
right?
But if everyone within the group is shamed, then it's, you know.
But I think when I came across Sylvan Tompkins' work, like when I've read a lot of stuff on shame, it doesn't have a lot of positive. It's not a positive affect.
Right.
It's not seen as a positive affect. And I think what I found when I started reading these people who were saying, let's look at shame in a different way. Let's think about what's productive about shame as opposed to always being this kind of negative affect is really what I'm trying to get at. And I think it still is. And maybe I need to drive home the kind of collectivity part of it a little bit more. than the individual.
I mean, because the part about you being shamed is almost like the traditional anthropological narrative of how I got accepted by the natives, right? So you could view, like, you hated it at the moment, but you could also view it as like, now this is where I show that I became one of the...
But it was part of, but Deborah, it was also part of the agreement when I came to the center. They said, if you want to be an anthropologist here, these are the criteria, that you also have to live with us. And you also will be subject. I mean, they were lighter on me. I was the yoga teacher, so they were lighter on me in terms of. But I think to me, the acceptance was when people started pulling me out in the hallways. They smoked cigarettes. I didn't, fortunately. To have long conversations about what they were doing and where they were going. To me, that was more. The criticism stuff was just like, hey, you're here. You think you're just going to observe us? No, you're not. We're going to observe you too. So that's kind of more my narrative of acceptance. But no, you're right. And maybe shame doesn't work. I mean, this is just kind of me playing around with it. I think in terms of, I mean, the book is written around keywords. So I have 6 keywords for each chapter, and this chapter right now is called shame. Maybe when I send it off, people will say, no, you can't use that word at all. Maybe they'll agree with you, Deborah, that it's something else.
I want to thank you for interesting talking. And wonderful. And I just wanted to say that maybe in Latin America it's called confrontation therapy. And I have been, when in my years of a student of medicine, I work in a rehabilitation center and with psychiatrists and everything. And we call it confrontation therapy.
Interesting.
And people come in around and someone will say everything that they feel, and it's not only Chinese, it's broadly studied. And it's a lapse between, people feel shame in the moment, and then the effects can be lost or can be gained depending on individual experience. It's something that is broadly known in the community of therapeutic.
But I think the difference there is when the directors from the U.S. come into the center and see this criticism, they see it as different than confrontational therapy. They label it as...
It will be because the United States won't go to the therapy community and they won't accept that someone can. It will be different, yes.
Yeah, right.
It is a shame to say that...
How long have you been planning that?
Spontaneous. But it is a pleasure to be able to thank you for a wonderful talk.
Well, and thank you for your wonderful questions.
Hey, so I get a friend.